The siren screamed like it knew his name. Red and blue light cracked the night open, flashing against scrap metal and frozen puddles, turning rust into something that looked alive. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, not from a wound, but from biting his tongue too hard. Cold seeped through his jacket. The air smelled of gasoline, wet steel, and something sour, fear, probably. Fear always had a smell. He stood still, hands already raised, palms slick with sweat, fingers trembling as if they belonged to someone else. The cuffs were colder than he expected. Heavy. Final. The click echoed louder than the siren. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from a loose pipe, each drop landing with quiet precision, counting time better than any clock ever could. 1 minute ago, he was a man on his own land. Now he was evidence. A deputy grabbed his arm. Not rough. Almost polite. That was the worst part. Politeness meant paperwork. Paperwork meant permanence. Turn around, someone said, voice flat, bored, like ordering coffee. He turned. Gravel bit into his knees as he stumbled. The ground was unforgiving, like memory. His breath came out in short bursts, white and frantic, fogging the air between him and the men who had already decided what this night meant. The lights reflected off their badges, bright and clean, untouchable. He wondered briefly if metal ever felt shame. Probably not. Metal just did what it was told. In the distance, a radio crackled. Words broke apart and reassembled themselves into something ugly. Location confirmed, suspect detained, proceed as planned. Planned. That word hung heavier than the cuffs. His name moved from mouth to mouth, losing pieces as it traveled. By the time it reached the far end of the scene, it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the report, to the file, to the story that was already being written without him. Steven Avery, not a man, but a problem with a history. A history the sirens remembered. The lights cut out suddenly. Silence fell hard, almost physical. The night exhaled. Without the noise, everything felt closer, the crunch of boots on gravel, the faint hum of an engine left running, the dry cough of someone who smoked too much and slept too little. He smelled cigarettes. Cheap ones. The kind that burned fast and left regret behind. Someone read him his rights. The words slid past his ears without landing. He'd heard them before. Different night. Same rhythm. Same ending. The law had a voice, and it never sounded surprised. As they guided him toward the car, his eyes caught on the edge of the salvage yard. Twisted frames of old vehicles stood like skeletons under the moonlight, silent witnesses that would never be called to testify. Rusted doors. Cracked windshields. Headlights that would never turn on again. Everything broken had a place here. Everything except doubt. The back door opened. The smell inside the cruiser was familiar, vinyl, disinfectant, old coffee. He ducked his head and slid in. The seat was sticky. Someone had spilled something weeks ago and never bothered to clean it. It felt symbolic. The door slammed shut, sealing him in with his breath and the echo of his own pulse. As the car pulled away, the yard shrank behind him, swallowed by darkness. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. There was a strange calm settling in his chest now, like resignation pretending to be strength. He had learned this part already. You don't scream. You don't run. You wait. Waiting is what they expect. The radio crackled again. A voice asked a question. Another answered. Decisions were made somewhere between those two sounds. He was not part of them. Through the window, the world slid by in fragments, trees, fences, a lonely porch light burning for no one. The siren stayed on, not because it was needed, but because it announced something important. This story was already public. Even if no one was watching yet. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. In the darkness, memories stirred, unwelcome and precise. Concrete walls. A narrow bed. Years stacked on top of each other until they stopped making sense. Freedom once tasted like air after drowning. Tonight, it tasted like rust. The car slowed. Turned. Slowed again. He didn't know where they were taking him. But he knew where this led. And the cruelest joke of all was simple. This was not the first time the sirens had come for him. You think truth is loyal. You think it stays where you leave it, waits patiently for the right moment, steps forward when called. You think if someone is innocent long enough, the world will eventually notice. That the system, flawed but decent, corrects itself when presented with facts sharp enough to cut through lies. You are wrong. Truth is a guest, not a resident. It comes when invited, leaves when bored, and never cleans up after itself. In the back of the moving car, Steven stared at the metal grid inches from his face. It separated him from the front seat, from the radio, from the small decisions being made about him in calm voices. The grid hummed softly with the vibration of the road, a cheap imitation of security. He wondered who it was really meant to protect. Outside, the night stretched endlessly. No witnesses. No judgment. Just asphalt and darkness. Funny thing about roads, they always look neutral, even when they lead somewhere terrible. People like stories with straight lines. Crime. Investigation. Justice. End credits. This one refused to behave. It bent back on itself, twisted, repeated sentences like a nervous habit. A man falsely convicted. Years lost. DNA, clean, indifferent, undeniable, opening a cell door like an embarrassed apology. Exonerated. Free. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because what happens when the system admits it was wrong, but never forgives the person who proved it? Steven shifted his hands inside the cuffs. His wrists burned. Not from pain, friction. Constant, low, irritating. The kind that didn't let you forget it was there. That was how memory worked too. Not dramatic. Just persistent. Somewhere ahead, paperwork was waiting. Forms with boxes already imagined, if not yet checked. He could picture them clearly. Height. Weight. Prior record. The last one always took up the most space. History never traveled light. A deputy laughed quietly in the front seat. Not at him. At something on the radio. A joke, maybe. Black humor came easily in cars like this. Laughter was lighter than doubt. Doubt required effort. Steven's reflection flickered in the window, distorted, sliced by passing lights. He didn't look like a villain. He didn't look like a victim either. He looked like what the system preferred. Familiar. Predictable. Already filed under before. That was the problem. You see, an innocent man is dangerous only once. After that, he becomes inconvenient. Proof embarrasses institutions. It costs money. It asks questions no one wants to answer at budget meetings. Better to turn the page quickly. Better still to use the same man as punctuation. The car stopped at a red light. For a moment, everything paused. The engine idled. The siren clicked off. Silence again. Steven could have sworn the world was holding its breath. He imagined, briefly, a different version of this night. One where the light stayed green. One where no one said his name into a radio. One where history, for once, learned something. The light changed. The car moved. Somewhere behind them, the idea of justice adjusted itself, just enough to stay comfortable. And somewhere ahead, a new chapter was already being drafted, its ending quietly assumed. What if being proven innocent once didn't save you? What if it marked you instead? Steven opened his eyes, jaw tightening, as the road curved toward a future that felt disturbingly familiar. He didn't know the details yet. He didn't know the accusation, the evidence, the headlines. But he knew this much with absolute clarity. This was not a mistake. And it was only the beginning. He grew up where things went to die. Not people, machines. Cars with their hearts ripped out, stacked in crooked rows like confessions no one bothered to finish. The salvage yard stretched wide and flat, a kingdom of rust and oil stains, where winter stayed longer than it was welcome and summer smelled like hot metal and old mistakes. This was home. Not comforting. Just familiar. Stephen learned early that silence was safer than explanation. Words came to him slowly, like they were checking the room before stepping inside. He spoke with pauses, with hesitation, as if every sentence might be used against him later. Which, as it turned out, was good instinct. His boots were always dirty. Not metaphorically. Literally. Mud, grease, snow packed into the seams. Clean shoes meant you didn't work. Or worse, that you pretended not to. Around here, pretending was unforgivable. People trusted rust more than polish. He walked with his shoulders slightly forward, like someone expecting impact. Not fear exactly, anticipation. The posture of a man who had learned that trouble rarely announced itself politely. Trouble just arrived and asked questions later. In school, teachers called him slow. Kids called him worse. He didn't argue. Arguing required confidence, and confidence required allies. He had neither. When you grow up on the edge of town, people don't bother learning your name properly. They learn the category instead. By the time law enforcement learned his face, it already felt inevitable. Small-town policing had a memory like an elephant and a conscience like a filing cabinet. He was questioned more than accused, watched more than warned. Patrol cars slowed when they passed him. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to be clear. Suspicion, after all, didn't need proof. It just needed repetition. He noticed how quickly stories formed. How a glance turned into a rumor. How a misunderstanding aged into a fact. It fascinated him in a bleak way, the efficiency of it all. No meetings. No votes. Just consensus through boredom. At night, lying in a room that smelled faintly of motor oil no matter how often it was cleaned, he listened to distant traffic and imagined other lives. Ones that moved forward. Ones that weren't already explained before they began. The thought never lasted long. Imagination, like optimism, was a luxury item. Then came the mistake. It wasn't dramatic. No thunder. No slow motion. Just a moment where the world tilted slightly and never corrected itself. A finger pointed. A statement taken. A version of events that fit too neatly to question. Stephen didn't understand all of it at the time. He just knew something had shifted. The air felt heavier. Conversations ended when he entered rooms. When they came for him the first time, the cuffs felt new. Shocking. Back then, there was still disbelief. A thin, fragile hope that this could be cleared up with a conversation, a clarification, a calm explanation. That hope didn't survive long. Prison taught him things no one ever explained outright. How time could stretch until it felt fictional. How routine replaced identity. How innocence, when repeated often enough, began to sound like stubbornness instead of truth. He watched men age in fast forward. He learned to read footsteps. To recognize keys by sound alone. Years passed. Not in chapters. In erosion. When science finally intervened, it did so without ceremony. A lab. A test. A result. No raised voices. No apologies. Just data quietly undoing a decade of certainty. Freedom arrived like an administrative error corrected at last. People expected him to celebrate. To smile. To forgive. But you don't come back from being erased. You just return with fewer pieces than you left with. Outside, the world had moved on without consulting him. Inside, something stayed locked. A reflex. A warning system permanently switched on. He was free, yes, but freedom had conditions now, written in invisible ink. And somewhere, buried beneath relief and disbelief, another realization settled in. The town hadn't changed. It had simply been waiting. The crime was almost too easy. That should have been the first warning. It began the way these things always do, not with violence, but with certainty. A woman identified him. confidently. No hesitation worth mentioning in the report. Confidence carried weight back then. More than contradictions. More than logic. More than the quiet discomfort of details that refused to line up. The paperwork was clean. Neat paragraphs. Dates spelled out. Statements trimmed of doubt like excess fat. Reading it later, you could almost admire the efficiency. This was how guilt was manufactured when raw material was already available. Steven didn't understand the language being used against him. Legal words moved faster than he could follow, looping around his answers, reframing his pauses as evasions. Silence became suspicious. Confusion became confirmation. Every attempt to explain sounded, to the wrong ears, like rehearsal. The trial had the rhythm of inevitability. Prosecutors spoke with calm authority, as if the outcome were already printed somewhere and they were just reading it aloud. The defense objected politely, like guests overstaying their welcome. The jury watched. Some with interest. Some with relief. Relief that it wasn't them. There was comfort in the idea that monsters were obvious. Steven sat still most days, hands folded, eyes drifting to the wood grain on the tables, tracing patterns that led nowhere. He noticed how often people avoided looking directly at him, like eye contact might complicate things. Guilt was easier when it stayed abstract. When the verdict came, it landed softly. No gasps. No chaos. Just words spoken in the right order. Guilty. Sentence. Years described as numbers too large to feel real yet. Applause did not break out, but something close to satisfaction settled in the room. Order restored. Story complete. Prison erased nuance quickly. Concrete walls absorbed sound but amplified time. Days blended. Weeks lost their edges. He learned which guards talked too much, which talked not at all. He learned that hope was dangerous, not because it was foolish, but because it hurt when it disappeared. Innocence became a private thing. Saying it out loud only irritated people. Other inmates had their own truths, all incompatible, all sincere. Steven listened more than he spoke. Silence was familiar. Silence didn't argue back. Years accumulated without drama. Birthdays passed unnoticed. Seasons announced themselves only through temperature changes in the air that crept through cracks in the walls. The outside world became theoretical, like a place described in books you no longer trusted. Then, without warning, science arrived. Not justice. Not mercy. Science. A sample. A test. DNA, 3 letters with no interest in reputation or narrative. The results contradicted everything. Quietly. Indisputably. The kind of contradiction that left no room for debate, only embarrassment. The system reacted the way systems do when confronted with proof. Slowly, defensively, and without emotion. Files reopened. Meetings scheduled. Language adjusted. No one said sorry. Apologies implied responsibility, and responsibility implied consequence. The cell door opened one ordinary day. Freedom did not feel like relief. It felt procedural. Like being released from a clerical error rather than a stolen life. Cameras flashed. Hands shook his. People called him lucky. Lucky. He stepped outside carrying years that no one could see. The sky looked the same. The air smelled different. Or maybe he did. Behind him, the institution corrected a line of text and moved on. Ahead of him, something else waited, patient, silent, and very familiar. Because when a system is proven wrong, it doesn't always learn. Sometimes, it prepares. DNA doesn't apologize. It doesn't lower its eyes or clear its throat before speaking. It doesn't explain how sorry it is for the years you spent learning the smell of disinfectant and despair. It just states a fact and waits for the room to deal with it. Steven learned that freedom, when delivered late, comes without instructions. One day he was a number on a door. The next, he was standing outside, squinting at a sky that felt too wide to trust. Reporters circled him like birds that smelled something edible but weren't sure what part. Microphones appeared where conversation should have been. Cameras replaced eye contact. Everyone wanted a sentence that could fit between commercials. He gave them very little. He wasn't angry the way people expected. Rage made good television. Tears sold even better. What he felt was quieter. Thinner. Like a wire pulled tight inside his chest. Anger required energy. He had spent most of his. The state issued statements. Carefully worded. Passive voice doing heavy lifting. Errors were acknowledged without being owned. Procedures were reviewed without being blamed. The system bent just enough to keep its shape. Someone mentioned compensation. Numbers were floated, then retracted, then floated again. Money has a strange way of sounding like justice to people who never need it either. Steven listened, nodded, signed where they told him. He knew better than to confuse a check with an apology. Back home, the salvage yard looked smaller. Or maybe he had changed scale. The same piles of rust. The same wind cutting across open land. Neighbors waved cautiously, like approaching an animal that might still be dangerous. Some avoided him entirely. Innocence, it turned out, didn't erase discomfort. It just complicated it. At night, sleep came in pieces. Dreams picked at old scars with surgical precision. Doors slamming. Keys jangling. A voice calling count. He woke with clenched fists and no memory of what he'd been fighting. Then there were the lawsuits. They formed quietly, like clouds that no one wanted to acknowledge until they blocked the sun. Papers filed. Names listed. Institutions implicated. Not out of spite, but necessity. Wrong had been done. The math was simple. The reaction was not. Suddenly, the air around him changed. Politeness grew brittle. Smiles arrived late and left early. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more refined. Resistance dressed as professionalism. Steven noticed patrol cars again. Not stopping. Just passing. Slowly. Black humor crept in where comfort should have been. He joked once that he should frame the DNA results and hang them on the wall, like a diploma. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else didn't laugh at all. The silence afterward said more than the joke ever could. Being proven right had a cost. It reminded powerful people of their fallibility. And institutions, like individuals, resented reminders that came with receipts. Steven felt it in the way conversations ended abruptly when he entered rooms. In the way doors closed a little more firmly than necessary. In the way his name traveled again, this time attached to words like liability and exposure. Freedom was still his. Technically. But it had acquired weight. Conditions. Attention. And then, one ordinary afternoon, a woman drove onto the property. Just another appointment. Just another vehicle crunching over gravel. Steven didn't know it yet, but somewhere between the sound of her tires and the closing of her car door, the balance shifted again. History, it seemed, wasn't finished with him. Not even close. Power does not like being embarrassed. It remembers slights longer than facts and forgives slower than people. Steven felt that truth in small, cumulative ways. Nothing overt. Nothing you could point to in court. Just pressure, applied evenly, patiently, like a thumb on a bruise. The lawsuit sat in the background of his days like a loaded gun on a table everyone pretended not to see. Numbers were whispered. Careers were implied. No one said his name out loud when discussing it, but it hovered anyway, unwelcome and unavoidable. He tried to live normally. Or something close to it. Morning meant cold air and the metallic cough of old engines. Work meant grease under his nails and the steady logic of broken things that could be fixed if you understood them well enough. Machines were honest. They didn't lie about what they were. They didn't pretend damage was intention. People did. He noticed how often officials showed up for reasons that didn't require showing up. Inspections. Questions. Friendly reminders. Each visit perfectly legal. Each one unnecessary. They walked the property with clipboards and neutral expressions, pausing just long enough to remind him who had the luxury of suspicion. Steven stood nearby, hands in his pockets, saying very little. Silence, again, felt safest. But silence also had a cost. It made space for others to fill in the blanks. The town watched from a distance. Some with sympathy. Others with something sharper. Exoneration had not rewritten the story in everyone's head. It had just added a footnote. And footnotes were easy to ignore. He felt eyes on him at the bar. Conversations dropped in volume when he sat down. Jokes died mid-sentence. Someone once said, half drunk and half brave, you know, they don't just lock up saints. Steven smiled thinly and took a sip of beer that tasted like metal and regret. Black humor had taught him restraint. Laughter was safer when it was aimed inward. The woman came on a weekday. Sunlight was weak, undecided. Autumn pretending it wasn't almost winter. She arrived for work, for business, for something small and transactional. A camera. A car. An appointment noted casually, like hundreds before it. She smiled politely. He nodded. Normal behavior exchanged like currency neither of them trusted much. She left. Or she was supposed to. Time passed without incident. An hour. Then 2. The afternoon settled. The sky dimmed. Somewhere, a decision was made to be concerned. Concern, Steven knew, aged quickly into certainty. When her car was found later, the distance between assumption and accusation collapsed instantly. Familiar names resurfaced with professional efficiency. Officers returned, this time less polite, their curiosity sharpened into focus. Steven watched it happen with a strange detachment, like DJVU without the comfort of inevitability. Questions came faster now. Sharper. Less interested in answers than alignment. His pauses were noted. His phrasing weighed. He could feel the shift in the air, the moment when inconvenience turned into opportunity. In the background, the lawsuit loomed. Unresolved. Expensive. Awkward. The timing was unfortunate. Or perfect. As night fell, lights appeared on the property again. Flashing. Cutting through darkness with aggressive confidence. Steven stood in the glow, hands at his sides, feeling an old reflex wake up in his body. He had been here before. And the cruel symmetry of it all pressed down on him with quiet force. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't argue. It acts. And somewhere, far from the flashing lights and the smell of cold steel, the cost of being right was about to be recalculated. The last appointment never announced itself as the last. It arrived wrapped in routine, wearing the neutral face of an ordinary workday. The kind people forgot as soon as it passed. No tension. No omen. Just tires on gravel and the soft click of a car door closing. The afternoon moved forward like it always did. Steven remembered the small details later, the way people always do when memory starts bargaining with regret. The angle of the sun. The dust hanging in the air. The polite distance in her voice. Normal things that became sacred once they were gone. When she didn't return, the silence spoke first. Phones rang. Messages stacked up unanswered. Concern spread not like panic, but like a slow leak, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. By early evening, worry had sharpened into something else. Something more decisive. Searches began. Not officially at first. Just people looking. Retracing steps. Asking questions that assumed nothing and everything at the same time. Her car was found where it shouldn't have been, empty in a way that felt intentional. The interior too clean. The absence too loud. By nightfall, the town had chosen a direction. Steven felt it before anyone said a word. The weight in the air. The sudden purpose in movement. Flashlights cutting across ground that had been walked 100 times without interest. Conversations that didn't include him but revolved around him anyway. History has momentum. Once it starts rolling, it prefers familiar paths. Law enforcement returned with focus this time, not curiosity. They moved through the property with the confidence of people who already knew what they were looking for. Or what they hoped to find. Multiple searches. Long days. Repeated passes over the same ground. Each visit framed as thoroughness, not persistence. Steven watched from a distance, jaw set, hands clenched just enough to ache. He answered when spoken to. He waited when told. Waiting had become a skill. A survival mechanism. Evidence appeared slowly, carefully, like props introduced at the right moment. Too neat. Too timely. Items surfaced after areas had already been cleared. Details shifted just enough to remain plausible. Nothing overt. Nothing impossible. Just enough. The media arrived soon after, drawn by the familiar outline of the story. A man with a past. A disappearance. A location that tied everything together conveniently. Cameras framed the salvage yard as if it were complicit, metal hulks looming like accomplices. Steven became quiet again in the way people mistake for guilt. Inside interrogation rooms, time distorted. Questions looped. Answers were tested, discarded, reshaped. The same moments revisited from different angles, as if repetition might turn uncertainty into confession. He felt the walls closing in, not physically, but narratively. The story was assembling itself around him, piece by piece, and he was no longer sure where to stand without becoming part of it. At night, he lay awake, staring into darkness that felt too similar to other darknesses he had known. The sound of keys returned in his memory, uninvited. So did the counting. So did the knowledge that once a direction is chosen, changing it requires more than truth. Outside, people spoke his name again. Louder this time. With less hesitation. Innocence, once proven, had lost its novelty. Suspicion was easier to recycle. Steven understood something then, with unsettling clarity. This wasn't about what had happened. It was about what had already happened once before, and how convenient it was to let it happen again. And as the investigation tightened its grip, he sensed the moment approaching, the familiar snap when possibility collapses into accusation. He had been free only long enough to remember what it felt like. Now the past was catching up, steady and relentless, ready to reclaim him. The evidence arrived like it had been waiting for permission. Search after search, day after day, the property was combed until routine blurred into ritual. Officers walked the same paths with different expressions, boots tracing familiar arcs in the dirt, eyes trained to notice what they had somehow missed before. Exhaustion became an ally. When people are tired enough, anything feels like discovery. Steven counted the searches in his head. Not because anyone asked him to, but because numbers were anchors. Numbers stayed put. Stories didn't. Keys were found where they hadn't been. Personal items surfaced after rooms had already been cleared, sealed, reopened, and cleared again. Each new piece was presented with a confidence that dared anyone to question the timing. Questions, after all, suggested distrust. Distrust suggested bias. And bias was something only defendants were accused of. The explanations were simple. Too simple. Mistakes happen. Evidence shifts. Oversights are corrected. The language of procedure wrapped every inconsistency in professionalism. It sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. And most people didn't. Close listening was work. Belief was easier. Steven watched the process with a growing sense of unreality. It felt less like an investigation and more like a performance rehearsed just enough to look spontaneous. Every discovery landed with the soft thud of inevitability, not surprise. He noticed how quickly conclusions formed after each find. No pause. No recalibration. Just confirmation stacked neatly on top of assumption. The narrative didn't bend, it absorbed. Black humor crept in again, unwelcome but persistent. He thought about how thorough they suddenly were. How focused. Where had this energy been before? It was almost flattering, in a way, to be taken so seriously now. Almost. The property transformed under the lights. At night, it looked theatrical, shadows exaggerated, angles sharpened, ordinary objects cast as threats. During the day, it returned to being what it always was. A place of broken things waiting to be sorted. Context depended entirely on who was holding the flashlight. Forensics entered the conversation like a final authority. Science again. But this time, science didn't arrive clean and distant. It came entangled in handling, transport, storage. In human hands. And human hands, Steven had learned, were not neutral instruments. Contradictions surfaced quietly. Reports that didn't quite match. Timelines that needed gentle adjustment. Nothing dramatic enough to stop the machine. Just enough friction to be noted by those already inclined to notice. Inclination, however, was rare. The media didn't linger on doubts. Doubt didn't photograph well. Certainty did. Headlines favored resolution over hesitation. The story tightened, sharpened, simplified. A second act demanded escalation, and the evidence obliged. Steven felt himself shrinking inside it all, not physically, but symbolically. He was no longer a person navigating events. He was an object being arranged. His reactions catalogued. His silences interpreted. His history resurrected and polished for reuse. At one point, an officer mentioned how unlikely it would be for all this to be coincidence. The statement hung in the air, rhetorical and complete. Steven almost smiled. Unlikely things happened all the time. That was the only thing he knew for sure. As the days blurred together, one thought refused to leave him alone. If evidence could appear this easily, what chance did absence ever have? The question lingered unanswered, heavy and corrosive, as the case hardened around him, layer by layer, detail by detail, until possibility itself felt like a luxury no longer available. And still, this was not the end. It was only the moment when the walls finished forming. The room was too bright for the things said inside it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, casting a pale glow over the table, the chairs, the young man sitting hunched forward as if trying to disappear into his own ribs. His knees bounced. His hands never stopped moving. Fingernails bitten down to nothing. Sweat gathered at his temples and slid slowly, tracing paths he didn't wipe away. He smelled like nervousness and cheap deodorant. Like a kid who had been told to sit still while something irreversible took shape around him. They spoke gently at first. Soft voices. Reassuring nods. Sympathy carefully measured. They told him they understood. That they knew he was scared. That they weren't angry. Anger was for later. Right now, they just wanted clarity. Clarity was a dangerous word. Questions came in circles. Same facts, different phrasing. Each pass tightened the space he was allowed to occupy. When he hesitated, they filled the silence for him. When he answered wrong, they corrected him. When he answered right, they praised him. He learned quickly which version of himself they preferred. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. The soda on the table went warm. The air grew stale. The hum of the lights became unbearable, a sound that drilled into the back of his skull. They told him what had happened. Not asked. Told. They spoke with confidence, describing events with a certainty that made disagreement feel childish. He nodded without realizing it. His head moved before his thoughts caught up. Agreement was easier than resistance. Resistance required strength he didn't have. Steven's name surfaced repeatedly, each time with more weight, more implication. The young man swallowed hard. Loyalty and fear wrestled quietly in his chest, neither winning cleanly. He wanted to help. He wanted it to stop. He wanted to go home. They reminded him how long he had been sitting there. They reminded him how serious things were. They reminded him, subtly, that cooperation mattered. Words like accident and mistake floated through the room like life preservers. You didn't mean to. You were confused. You were young. You just got caught up in something bigger than you understood. Each sentence offered an exit, as long as he walked through it the right way. By the time the confession took shape, it barely felt like his anymore. It sounded practiced. Smooth in places. Uncertain in others. A story assembled from fragments he recognized and pieces he didn't. But it flowed, and flow was rewarded. When it was over, he slumped back in his chair, drained, eyes unfocused. The relief was immediate and terrible. He had given them what they wanted. The pressure eased. Smiles returned. Someone patted his shoulder. Good job. Outside that room, the confession moved quickly. Faster than doubt ever could. It filled gaps. It connected dots that had floated too far apart. It gave the narrative a spine. Inside another room, Steven heard about it secondhand. The words reached him stripped of context, delivered like a verdict rehearsing itself. He felt something cold settle in his stomach, heavier than fear. Recognition. He knew that room. He knew those lights. He knew that tone. This was how guilt was transferred, redistributed like weight no one wanted to carry alone. The young man would live with those words forever, whether they were true or not. Steven understood that too. Some sentences didn't require prison to be permanent. As the case accelerated, fueled now by confession and coincidence alike, Steven felt the final shape of the story locking into place. It didn't matter how it had been built. It mattered only that it stood. And once a story like this learns to stand on its own, it rarely lets anyone push it over. The courtroom smelled of polished wood, paper, and stale ambition. It was a space designed to impress, to make every word feel important, even when it wasn't. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, cutting the room into stripes of light and shadow. He noticed how the shadows reached toward him, greedy, almost conspiratorial. Steven sat rigid, hands folded on the table, knuckles white beneath the thin skin. His jacket smelled faintly of his own sweat, a reminder that the body never forgets tension. Every step of the trial had been measured, rehearsed, and yet it still held the power to suffocate. The prosecutor spoke first. Calm. Authoritative. Certain. He painted a picture so complete it left little room for doubt. Words stacked like bricks. Every sentence was a brushstroke in a painting of guilt so vivid it almost convinced the air itself. The defense objected, paused, tried to carve space for nuance. The judge nodded politely, acknowledging the effort but not the efficacy. This was the theater of justice. Gestures mattered, arguments less so. Outside, cameras focused on him, filming the folds in his brow, the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor in his hands. He became a symbol, a character, a cautionary tale, all before the first witnesses testified. The witnesses arrived. Some spoke in monotone, some with rehearsed emotion. Every word, carefully chosen or not, added weight to the story. Silence became conspicuous. Questions hung in the air, answered and unanswered. Each pause was interpreted as guilt or confusion. Interpretation mattered more than reality. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively. Steven remained still. He had grown accustomed to waiting. Years of false certainty had taught him the patience of someone who knows the machinery of accusation intimately. Verdict day arrived without fanfare. Words were spoken clearly, crisply, like a menu read aloud. Guilty. Sentenced. Time quantified in numbers that blurred into abstraction. Order restored. Headlines already written in the minds of readers. The cameras left. The lights dimmed. The room emptied. Only the echo of procedure remained, bouncing off walls that had seen countless dramas unfold without care for truth. Steven walked out slowly, aware that everyone watching was only watching the performance. They did not see the men who had been exonerated once. They did not see the years stolen. They only saw what fit neatly into a narrative. Justice, he realized, had little to do with truth. It preferred closure over clarity, simplicity over complexity. The cost of being inconvenient had always been high, and now it was exacted again, silently, efficiently, perfectly. Outside the courthouse, the world hummed along as if nothing had happened. People walked, cars passed, and the sun moved slowly across the sky. The story, however, had already left him behind, locked in a sequence of decisions that could not be undone. And in the quiet moments that followed, one truth became painfully clear. Being right once had not guaranteed anything. Not safety. Not understanding. Not even recognition of what had truly been done. Because in the machinery of certainty, innocence was fragile. It was temporary. It was almost meaningless. And yet, it had existed once. That much, at least, no one could take away. The cameras arrived quietly, but their presence was deafening. They didn't need to knock. They didn't need permission. They just entered, lenses trained, notebooks open, capturing the minutiae of a life that had already been dissected once. Steven became both subject and observer, watched while he moved, observed while he existed. The salvage yard felt different under their gaze. Rust glistened unnaturally in the floodlights. Shadows sharpened like they were rehearsing for their lines. The wind, carrying the faint tang of oil and cold metal, seemed louder when microphones hummed. Every object, every corner, every scrap of memory was suddenly content. Reality had been edited before it even happened. He sat for interviews, answering questions he didn't fully trust. Cameras recorded his pauses. Microphones captured his breaths. Each hesitation became a headline. Each glance out the window a revelation. He felt like a character in someone else's story, a living file that had to perform convincingly enough to satisfy strangers. Black humor lingered in the edges of these moments. He joked once that he should charge admission. The producers laughed politely. But the truth of the joke, the absurdity of being both notorious and invisible, settled heavier than any cuff. The public was divided. Believers on one side, executioners on the other. Comments online ranged from sympathetic to cruel, judgment delivered in bite-sized sentences, opinions formed without nuance. A man who had been exonerated once became a question mark in a courtroom drama that never ended. He noticed the irony constantly. Cameras captured the yard that had defined his early life, yet no lens could capture the years that had been stolen. Freedom had been documented, analyzed, replayed, and yet, it never felt like liberation. It felt performative, like a role he had learned to play convincingly to an audience that only knew the plot. Even friends approached differently. Smiles were tentative. Conversations cautious. Everyone seemed aware that proximity came with risk. Innocence, after being proven once, was no longer just a fact. It was a curiosity. A spectacle. A warning. Inside his own home, he sometimes caught himself staring at objects the cameras had missed. A rusted wrench. A cracked window. A piece of the yard untouched by production. These were unedited realities, private and stubbornly mundane. They were proof that some truths survived, even if the story wanted them erased. Night fell, and with it came the quiet reprieve of solitude. He could hear his own breathing, the wind through the trees, the distant hum of highway traffic. For a moment, the cameras were gone. The lights off. The world narrowed to the tangible, the immediate, the unobserved. Yet, even in these moments, the story loomed. Its shadow extended into every decision, every step, every pause. Fame in this form was a cage gilded with recognition, a confinement made of perception. He was visible, but not understood. Seen, but not free. He realized then that the documentary wasn't just about him. It was about a system, an institution, a town, a culture that needed stories to function. People wanted resolution, simplicity, heroes and villains. The truth, the messy, inconvenient truth, was rarely that obedient. And in the quiet hours, Steven understood the unspoken contract he had unknowingly signed. He could exist publicly, but only as long as the cameras agreed with reality. As long as the story remained compelling. As long as the world continued to need him as a symbol rather than a man. The irony tasted bitter. He had been freed once by science, only to be trapped again by narrative. The cage had changed shape, but it remained. Outside, the lights of the salvage yard glimmered like a warning. Inside, he stared at his reflection, wondering if the world would ever see the men behind the frame. But the truth rarely arrives at the right angle. And this story was not done with him yet. Time slowed again, but differently this time. It was not the endless stretch of a prison sentence, measured in monotone days and echoing footsteps. No, this was measured in waiting for motions, appeals, paperwork that crawled through the bureaucratic machinery at a pace designed to frustrate. Every response came carefully, politely, in legalese that hid its teeth. Steven moved through it like a shadow. He answered letters, met deadlines, attended meetings. Each interaction was precise, neutral. Politeness became armor, distance became habit. He had learned that the system did not need to crush him outright. It merely needed to exist, patiently, predictably, indifferent to human desire. Patrol cars passed more often now, slow and casual. Officials called with reminders, questions phrased as friendly check-ins. The underlying message was always the same. We know you are inconvenient, and we are still in charge. The salvage yard became a theater of observation. Vehicles lined up differently, equipment shifted slightly, objects repositioned. Not maliciously. Not aggressively. Subtlety was the instrument of power. Everything in its place, the system signaling its presence without announcing it. And the public remained hungry. They read every headline, watched every clip, dissected every interview. Some saw men wronged once. Others saw men who had survived mistakes only to invite suspicion again. Consensus did not matter. What mattered was perception, and perception is never neutral. Even at home, time refused to be kind. Sleep came fitfully. Memories that should have been settled stirred uninvited. Images of locked doors, flashing lights, and cold metal hummed through his nights. He had seen the machinery of accusation up close, and its efficiency left an imprint no freedom could erase. Through it all, Steven reflected quietly. Philosophical questions surfaced without fanfare. How much of life was chance? How much was design? And how much was simply the persistence of other people's narratives, written without your consent, performed without your awareness? Appeals came and went. Denials arrived with the precision of clockwork. He noted them but did not react. Reaction wasted energy. Energy was now reserved for observation. Watching the system reaffirm itself over and over, its priorities untouched by morality or consequence, became its own kind of study. Friends and family navigated the same landscape cautiously, careful not to provoke scrutiny. Trust was finite, and everyone knew it. The past had taught its lessons. Freedom was fragile, and attention could be dangerous. Steven's reflection in mirrors and windows became a private dialogue. He recognized the same calm exterior he had learned to wear, but the eyes beneath carried knowledge that no one could see. The cost of survival in a system designed to ignore humanity while performing justice. Outside, the world spun as if unaware. The sun rose. Traffic moved. Headlines changed. But the machinery kept turning. It did not forget. It did not forgive. It did not apologize. And somewhere beneath all the procedure and observation, the quiet awareness lingered. The story was still alive, still forming, still capable of claiming him again. Because systems like this do not pause. They do not hesitate. They do not blink. They simply wait. And Steven Avery understood that, better than most. In the end, nothing wrapped itself in neat conclusions. The courtroom doors closed. The cameras were packed away. Headlines faded to the next scandal, the next crime, the next story the public could digest without effort. Life, the kind that cannot be captured or scripted, continued in its relentless, unremarkable way. Steven walked the salvage yard alone one late afternoon, boots crunching over gravel and metal scraps that had been witnesses to every twist of his life. The wind carried the familiar tang of rust and oil, familiar enough to be comforting, alien enough to remind him he had survived, but not unscathed. Every step stirred memories, of cuffs, of cells, of DNA labs, of flashing lights in the night. He had been erased, restored, accused again, watched, judged, filmed. The cycle never ended. No apologies came. No understanding arrived in letters or words. The cost of survival was etched invisibly into every line of his face, every movement of his hands, every pause before he spoke. He understood now that truth is not permanent. It can be displaced, manipulated, or ignored entirely. Friends and strangers treated him with caution. Some believed his innocence once, some doubted it now. Perception had replaced reality. In a town that had judged him before, proof did not matter as much as narrative. Innocence is a story that only some are willing to retell. At night, the wind shifted. Shadows stretched across the yard. The metal hulk stood silent, indifferent, as they always had. He remembered every interrogation room, every flashing light, every painstakingly documented misstep of his life. Memory was a cruel companion, always accurate, never forgiving. He realized something essential. Freedom had never been his to keep. It was borrowed, temporary, conditional on the complacency of others. The system had allowed it, only to remind him that it could be taken away again, or twisted, or observed until he was a symbol rather than a man. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all. Not the sentence, not the accusation, not the imprisonment, but the relentless attention of the world, the constant scrutiny, the invisible ledger where every move was counted, measured, weighed, and judged. Steven stood in the yard and breathed in the cold air. The smell of metal and oil, of history and inevitability, clung to him. He could feel the past lingering, and the present pressing, and the future, always uncertain, hovering like a question mark. No moral lessons. No fairy tale endings. Only the cost of decisions, actions, and inaction. Only the quiet reflection that sometimes, no one survives the machinery of narrative intact. He walked away slowly. The night closed in. The stars were indifferent witnesses. The yard behind him kept its secrets, silent and unjudging. And in the deepest quiet, one thought remained, echoing like a bell in a hollow space. Sometimes truth survives. Sometimes it is simply replaced. The world moved on. Steven Avery remained. But the story was far from finished.